Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it walks back into your life wearing the same shoes you once bought for it. I helped him when he had nothing, and the first letter I received from him afterward was not a thank you. It was a court notice with my name spelled like an accusation. I didn't raise my voice when I read it. I didn't rush to defend myself. I just sat there, holding the paper, realizing that some people don't fall when you lift them up. They learn how high you are standing, and then they aim. He had been living 2 houses down, in a quiet American suburb where lawns were trimmed and problems were hidden behind curtains. I noticed him the way you notice absence before presence. His lights were always off. His mailbox overflowed. His car never moved. Then one evening, I saw him sitting on the curb, head in his hands, like a man who had misplaced his life and didn't know where to look next. I didn't know his full story then. I only knew what I saw. Clothes worn thin. Hands shaking, not from cold, but from a long fight with uncertainty. When he looked up at me, his eyes weren't asking for money. They were asking for permission to exist without shame. I told myself it would be temporary. Just a few weeks. Just a couch, a meal, a shower, a chance to stand upright again. I told myself kindness was still a currency that paid interest. That was my first mistake. Not the kindness itself. The assumption. He said he had lost his job. A construction injury. A company that cut him loose the moment he slowed down. A landlord who didn't wait for excuses. A divorce that had already hollowed him out. His words came out slow, like he was rationing truth. I listened. I always listen. That's something age teaches you. People reveal themselves if you give them silence. I let him stay in my guest room. I helped him file paperwork. I drove him to interviews. I lent him money I didn't track. I introduced him to neighbors as a friend going through a rough patch, because dignity matters when everything else has been stripped away. Weeks turned into months. He started standing taller. He started correcting me when I spoke. Small things at first. A tone. A look. Then one night, over dinner, he joked about how easy my life must have been. He said it lightly. Too lightly. I smiled and let it pass. Pride likes to announce itself early. The case came 6 months later. Not from nowhere. From patience. From planning. He claimed I had exploited him. That I had charged him rent. That I had threatened eviction. That I had coerced labor in exchange for shelter. Lies don't always scream. Sometimes they are typed neatly, signed, and mailed. The paper said he wanted compensation. Emotional distress. Financial damages. Punitive intent. Words designed to sound righteous. I remember folding the notice carefully. Not because I respected it. Because I respect control. Fear wants reaction. Power waits. I didn't confront him. I didn't call him. I didn't warn the neighbors. I let him believe the silence meant weakness. People who file cases often mistake quiet for surrender. I went back through my memory instead. Every conversation. Every text. Every witness who had seen him eat at my table. Every job interview I had driven him to. Every receipt I never asked him to repay. I remembered the day he borrowed my laptop. The night he used my address on a job application. The voicemail he left when he was drunk, thanking me for saving his life. Gratitude is dangerous when it's recorded. I spoke to a lawyer, but not the aggressive kind. I wanted someone who understood patience. Someone who knew that truth doesn't need volume. They told me to let the process unfold. So I did. At the first hearing, he avoided my eyes. He spoke confidently to the room, telling his version like he had rehearsed it in the mirror. He described himself as vulnerable. Me as calculated. He wore a clean jacket I remembered buying him. I watched. Listening. His story had gaps. Small ones. Dates that didn't align. Claims that required solitude to be true, when half the street had seen otherwise. Lies grow best in darkness. He had grown them in daylight. When it was my turn, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I answered exactly what was asked. No more. No less. Then my lawyer placed the evidence gently on the table. Texts, emails, voicemails, statements from neighbors. A timeline that didn't bend. You could feel the air change. Not dramatically. Just enough. He started adjusting in his seat, correcting himself, adding explanations no one had requested. Truth doesn't chase lies. Lies chase themselves into corners. By the third session, his lawyer asked for a settlement. By the fourth, he withdrew the case. That's not the part people expect to matter. They think the win is the ending. It isn't. A week later, he moved out of the neighborhood. Quietly. No goodbye. No apology. No explanation. I never asked for one. Justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just restores balance and leaves. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was clarity. I learned that helping someone doesn't give you control over who they become. It only shows them who you are. Some people confuse support with leverage. They think survival is a ladder meant to be kicked away once climbed. I didn't regret helping him. Regret is a luxury for people who act without thought. I acted with intention. What I learned was simpler. Compassion needs boundaries. Silence can be strategy. And when someone betrays you after you save them, the most powerful response is not revenge, but letting truth stand where lies cannot. Sometimes silence is the best revenge. I didn't tell anyone about the notice at first. Not because I was ashamed, but because words have a way of inviting opinions, and opinions invite noise. I wanted quiet. Quiet is where patterns show themselves. The house felt different after that. Same walls. Same furniture. But trust leaves a temperature when it exits. Rooms grow colder without changing shape. He still lived there then. Walking through my hallway like nothing had shifted. Drinking coffee from my mug. Asking casual questions about my day. He didn't know I had read the document. Or maybe he assumed I would panic first. Some people believe fear is universal. I watched him closely, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. When someone decides to betray you, their body usually knows before their mouth admits it. His movements were sharper. His kindness became performative. He laughed louder when neighbors were around. He avoided being alone with me. I realized then that the case wasn't a reaction. It was a plan already in motion. That night, I lay awake replaying the months backward. Not emotionally. Methodically. Like rewinding surveillance footage. I remembered the first week he stayed. How he insisted on sleeping on the couch, saying the guest room was too much. How quickly that humility disappeared once he felt secure. I remembered the way he asked questions about my finances. Casual ones. How long I'd owned the house. Whether it was paid off. How much I thought it was worth now. At the time, I thought it was curiosity mixed with insecurity. Now I heard something else in those questions. Measurement. He had studied me the way some men study locks. In the second month, he started keeping notes. I once saw a small notebook on the kitchen counter. When I asked what it was, he said it helped him stay organized. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. People reveal themselves without interrogation. I also remembered the small conflicts. How he once accused me of holding it over him, when I reminded him of an interview he was late for. How he snapped when I suggested he contribute to groceries once he got a temporary paycheck. His gratitude had limits. His entitlement didn't. Still, I kept things calm. I believe in steady surfaces. Turbulence invites mistakes. The next morning, I made breakfast as usual. Eggs, toast, coffee. He sat across from me, scrolling through his phone. I noticed his hands didn't shake anymore. Stability had done its work. He looked up and asked if any mail had come. I said yes. He waited. I took a sip of coffee and said nothing else. That silence landed between us like a coin on a table. He smiled, thinly, and went back to his phone. But his foot started tapping. Fast. Irregular, he knew. Over the next few days, he became careful. Overly careful. He cleaned the guest room without being asked. He documented chores with photos. I once caught him recording a conversation we were having about trash pickup. He didn't deny it. He said it was for accountability. I nodded. Accountability is an interesting word. People use it most when they're building an alibi. I continued my routine. Went to work. Came home. Spoke little. Watched more. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped me while I was checking the mailbox. She asked if everything was okay. She said he had told her he might be moving out soon because of tension. I thanked her for the concern. Said nothing else. That was when I understood the story he was telling wasn't just for court. It was for the street. Reputation is often the first battlefield. I started documenting too. Quietly. Dates. Times. What was said. Who was present. I didn't embellish. I didn't interpret. I wrote only what happened. Truth doesn't need decoration. At night, I listened to him pace his room. He spent hours on calls, whispering. Once, I heard my name spoken with a tone I had never heard before. Not anger. Calculation. He was rehearsing. The day he officially moved out, he packed quickly. No emotion. No confrontation. He left the key on the counter and said he'd be in touch through proper channels. He smiled when he said it, like someone who believes they've already won. I told him to take care, and I meant it. The house grew quieter after that. But quiet doesn't mean empty. It means space to think clearly. That week, letters started arriving. Requests for information. Formal language designed to provoke response. I read them once and filed them away. Reaction is what gives false stories momentum. I went back further in my memory. Before him. Before the house. Before the comfort. I remembered my father's voice. He used to say that justice moves slowly because it carries weight. Rush it, and you spill what matters. I called the lawyer again. We reviewed everything. He asked me if I was angry. I said no. He smiled. Said that would help. As the days passed, I noticed something unexpected. Relief. Not because the conflict was pleasant, but because clarity had returned. Ambiguity is exhausting. Once lines are drawn, even unfairly, you know where to stand. I also noticed something else. I wasn't afraid of losing. Not the house. Not money. Not reputation. What I was afraid of, briefly, was losing my belief in helping people. That's a quieter fear. More dangerous. But as I sat alone one evening, looking at the chair where he used to sit, I realized something important. He hadn't taken that from me. He had only shown me the cost of offering it without limits. The case moved forward on its own schedule. Papers. Dates. Neutral rooms with uncomfortable chairs. I showed up each time on time, calm, prepared. He showed up different each time. Sometimes confident. Sometimes defensive. Sometimes trying to appear wounded. His story shifted subtly, trying to adjust to resistance. Consistency is the enemy of lies. One afternoon, during a break, he walked past me in the hallway. He stopped. Looked at me closely. Like he was searching for something. Fear. Anger. Pleading. He found none. That unsettled him more than any argument could have. As he walked away, I understood then that this wasn't about money. It never was. It was about control. About rewriting history so he could stand as the injured party instead of the indebted one. Some people can't live with the idea that they were helped. It reminds them of weakness they'd rather erase. I let him try. Because I knew something he didn't. Time doesn't take sides, but it exposes them. And I had nothing to hide. The next hearing was scheduled for early morning. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I don't like being rushed into seriousness. The building was already awake, humming with low voices and polished impatience. I sat where I could see the door. Habit, not fear. Awareness. When he walked in, he looked different again. New haircut. New confidence. He had learned how to dress like someone who belonged there. I noticed his eyes searched the room before they found me. When they did, they didn't linger. He nodded once. Barely. As if we were strangers who had once shared an inconvenience. That was fine. Distance helps memory stay accurate. The session itself moved slowly. Statements. Clarifications. Formalities that pretend neutrality while quietly measuring credibility. He spoke first. His voice carried certainty, but it strained under it. Certainty that needs effort is usually borrowed. He described timelines that bent around convenience. Claimed emotional pressure without describing a single moment clearly. General words. Vague pain. A performance polished enough to convince someone who wasn't listening closely. I listened closely. When it was my turn, I didn't defend myself. I answered. Short. Clean. No adjectives. I described what I did. When. Where. Who else was present. I didn't say why I helped him. Motivation invites interpretation. Actions stand alone. There was a pause afterward. The kind that doesn't feel empty. The kind that asks a question without speaking. I could feel him shifting beside his lawyer. Adjusting his posture. He had expected confrontation. Anger. Maybe even an apology. He got none of it. Afterward, in the hallway, his lawyer asked mine for a private conversation. They stepped aside. I stayed where I was, looking at a framed notice on the wall about conduct and decorum. Rules written for people who need reminders. When my lawyer returned, he told me quietly that the other side wanted more time. Needed to clarify certain inconsistencies. I nodded. Inconsistencies are what happen when stories are built forward instead of remembered backward. The weeks that followed were slow. Not empty. Slow with intention. I kept living my life. Work. Groceries. Mornings that began the same way they always had. I didn't rehearse arguments. I didn't imagine speeches. I trusted the record. Occasionally, I heard things. A neighbor mentioned he had told them the case was going well. Someone else said he was planning a fresh start once it was over. Confidence spoken too early always sounds louder than it should. Then came the request. A formal motion asking for financial documentation. Bank statements. Proof of ownership. Employment records. They wanted to see if I could be framed as someone with resources worth taking. I provided everything without complaint. Transparency is uncomfortable only when you're hiding something. What surprised me wasn't their strategy. It was his impatience. He started pushing deadlines. Sending messages through his lawyer that sounded emotional. Urgent. As if time itself was betraying him now. At one point, he tried to reframe the story entirely. Claimed our relationship had been transactional. That help had been offered with unspoken expectations. That kindness had been conditional. That was the angle he settled on. Not abuse. Obligation. That's when the quiet work paid off. My lawyer introduced statements. Not dramatic ones. Simple observations. A neighbor who had heard him say he was lucky to have a place to crash. A former coworker I had driven him to meet, who remembered him calling me a lifesaver. A voicemail played calmly into the room, his voice tired and grateful, thanking me for not letting him end up on the street. Gratitude doesn't age well when it contradicts ambition. He tried to explain it away. Said he had been emotional. Vulnerable. Not thinking clearly. That explanation worked against him more than anything else. If he wasn't thinking clearly when he thanked me, how clearly was he thinking now? There was a moment when I saw it in his face. The realization. Not that he was losing. That he had misjudged me completely. He had thought I was passive. That my calm meant compliance. That my silence meant fear. He hadn't understood restraint. By the final hearing, the room felt different. Not tense. Settled. Like a decision that had already been made and was just waiting to be spoken. His lawyer spoke carefully. Avoided absolutes. Suggested compromise. Used words like misunderstanding and mutual responsibility. Mine didn't argue. He summarized. Cleanly. He let the record speak. He didn't accuse character. He outlined behavior. The ruling came shortly after. The case was dismissed. Not quietly. Firmly. The language was measured, but the meaning was clear. The claims were unsupported. The narrative unreliable. He didn't look at me when it was over. I packed my papers slowly. Not to savor the moment. To stay grounded. Winds that are rushed don't last long in the mind. Outside, the air felt lighter. Not because I had won. Because I hadn't lost myself in the process. Weeks passed. Life resumed its rhythm. Then came the final echo. I received a message. Short. Direct. He apologized. Not well. Not fully. But enough to show awareness. He said he had been afraid of going back to nothing. That fear had made him reckless. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish him. Because closure doesn't always require conversation. I thought about him often after that. Not with resentment. With understanding sharpened by boundaries. I realized something important had happened. Not just legally. Internally. Helping someone doesn't bind them to gratitude. It binds you to your values. And when those values are tested, how you respond matters more than the outcome. I didn't harden. I didn't retreat. I adjusted. Now, when I help, I do so with clarity. With structure. With kindness that doesn't blur into obligation. Some people see that as distance. I see it as wisdom. What he tried to take from me wasn't money or reputation. It was my belief that quiet goodness still had a place in a loud world. He failed. Because in the end, the truth didn't need me to fight for it. It only needed me to stay still long enough for it to arrive. And when it did, it stood exactly where I had been all along. Betrayal doesn't end when a case is dismissed. It lingers in the quiet, forcing you to examine how easily trust once moved through your hands. After everything settled, I went back to the beginning, not to relive it, but to understand how it started without noise. That mattered to me. If you don't understand the start, you repeat it with different faces. The neighborhood had always been calm. Lawns trimmed on Saturdays. Garbage cans rolled out like clockwork. People waved without asking questions. It was the kind of place where trouble felt temporary, like a passing storm that never quite arrived. I had lived there long enough to blend into the background. Not invisible, just unremarkable. I went to work, came home, kept my routine simple. I liked it that way. Peace doesn't need witnesses. The house itself wasn't impressive, but it was solid. One story. Wide windows. A small guest room that had only been used when family visited years ago. It held quiet well. I valued that. Before he appeared in my life, I had already learned a few things the hard way. I had been betrayed before, just not like this. Different context. Same lesson. People don't always hurt you because they are cruel. Sometimes they hurt you because they are desperate to escape who they are. That belief shaped how I saw him that first evening. He didn't knock. He was sitting on the curb, elbows on knees, staring at the ground like it might open and take him somewhere else. I remember slowing my steps without thinking. Something about stillness like that always pulls my attention. When I asked if he was okay, he didn't answer right away. He looked up slowly, measuring whether honesty was safe. Then he said he was figuring things out. That phrase carries more weight than it admits. I asked if he needed help. He shook his head first. Pride reflex. Then nodded. Survival instinct. Those two gestures told me more than his words ever could. I invited him inside because I remembered what it felt like to be one bad week away from everything collapsing. I remembered how quickly dignity erodes when uncertainty stretches too long. Inside, he moved carefully, eyes scanning, shoulders tense. He apologized for everything. The space, the inconvenience, the air. I told him he didn't have to. We talked little that first night. I offered food. He accepted with relief that tried to hide itself. He slept on the couch, fully dressed, shoes by his side, prepared to leave at the first sign of rejection. The next morning, he thanked me more than necessary. Repeated it. Overcompensated. Gratitude still intact then. I told him he could use the guest room. He hesitated, asked how long. I said we'd see. That was the moment the story really began. Not the lawsuit. Not the hearings. That sentence. We'll see. Boundaries start there. Or fail there. At first, everything felt balanced. He helped around the house without being asked. Cleaned. Cooked occasionally. Spoke carefully. He was the best version of himself because he needed to be. He shared pieces of his past in fragments. A job that ended suddenly. A marriage that dissolved quietly. Friends who disappeared when his usefulness did. Nothing dramatic. Just erosion. I listened without judgment. Silence invites honesty when interrogation doesn't. Weeks passed. He found temporary work. Construction. Day labor. Paid in cash sometimes. He started staying out later. Coming home tired but steadier. Confidence returned in small increments. With confidence came familiarity. He stopped asking before using things. He stopped apologizing. He started commenting on how I lived. Why I worked so much. Why I didn't travel. Why I didn't upgrade the kitchen. Observation slowly turning into assessment. I noticed it, but I didn't confront it. Growth often comes with awkward edges. I gave it space. What I didn't see then was how his identity was shifting. He wasn't just recovering. He was rewriting his position in the story. No longer the one who had been helped, but the one who had endured something unfair. People do that when shame becomes uncomfortable. They flip the script to breathe. He began framing his past in harsher tones. Employers became villains. Landlords became predators. Every authority figure had wronged him. Responsibility evaporated from the narrative. I still didn't challenge it. Everyone needs to process loss in their own way. The change became clearer when he started asking about legal things. Tenants' rights. Employment protections. Liability. Casual questions. Academic curiosity, he said. I answered what I knew. Suggested resources for what I didn't. He nodded. Took mental notes. I remember the first time he raised his voice. It was over nothing. A misunderstanding about a bill. He corrected himself quickly. Apologized. Said stress was getting to him. I accepted it. That's the moment I think about now. Not with regret. With awareness. Kindness isn't blindness. It's patience. But patience without observation is just avoidance wearing a softer name. By the time he started calling the house ours, something had already shifted. Language is the first claim people make. I didn't correct him. I should have. Not angrily. Clearly. Instead, I told myself things would settle once he was fully back on his feet. That stability would bring gratitude back into balance. I underestimated how intoxicating stability can be to someone who has lived without it. The neighborhood saw him differently too. He became visible. Familiar. People greeted him by name. Asked how he was doing. He told his story with more confidence each time. Emphasized struggle. Softened the help. I heard echoes of it through others. Adjusted versions. Nothing overtly false. Just incomplete. Still, I said nothing. Silence can be generous. It can also be permission. When the guest room stopped feeling like a favor and started feeling like a right, the foundation was already cracked. I didn't know then how deep it went. only that something felt misaligned. That's the thing about the setup phase of betrayal. It never announces itself. It arranges itself quietly, using your own goodwill as scaffolding. Looking back, I don't blame myself. Awareness comes from contrast. You don't know where the line is until someone steps over it. Part 2 of this story isn't about him. It's about me learning where my responsibility ends. Because helping someone rise doesn't mean letting them stand on your shoulders. And I was about to learn that lesson in full. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened in tone first. In posture. In the way he spoke when he thought he had leverage. He started coming home later, sometimes past midnight, sometimes smelling like cheap beer and borrowed confidence. Not drunk enough to stumble. Just loose enough to forget restraint. He would talk more on those nights. About plans. About people who owed him. About how the world had a way of pushing decent men into corners. I listened from my chair, saying little. Alcohol doesn't create truth, but it removes the filter that hides intention. He began talking about fairness a lot. About how people with stability didn't understand what it was like to start over. How systems were designed to favor those who already had something. He never said my name in those moments, but he didn't have to. His eyes did the pointing. One night, he asked me directly if I thought he owed me anything. The question wasn't curious. It was defensive. I told him no. That help given with conditions wasn't help. It was a transaction. And that wasn't what this was. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded like someone agreeing in public while disagreeing in private. From that point on, every gesture became a calculation. He kept track of what he did around the house. Mentioned it casually. As if building a ledger. He would remind me when he took out the trash. When he fixed a loose hinge. When he picked up groceries once with his own money. I thanked him each time. Not because it was necessary. Because acknowledgement matters. But gratitude started feeling like fuel instead of balance. He also started pushing small boundaries. Playing music louder than usual. Inviting people over without asking. Parking his car in a way that blocked mine. Each thing minor on its own. Together, they formed a pattern of occupation. I still didn't confront him. I adjusted. Parked differently. Went to bed earlier. Avoided friction. Avoidance feels like peace until it costs you authority. The first real confrontation came over the guest room. He told me he wanted to repaint it. Said it didn't feel like home yet. Used the word yet deliberately. As if time would turn permission into entitlement. I told him no. Not harshly. Just clearly. The silence that followed was heavy. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He just nodded and walked away. That reaction told me more than anger would have. After that, the atmosphere changed. Conversations became shorter. Politeness replaced warmth. He started spending more time outside the house. On his phone. On calls he took in the driveway. I noticed him documenting things more openly. Writing. Recording. Photographing spaces that didn't need recording. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was keeping track of his contributions. I told him that wasn't necessary. He said he preferred it that way. That was when I realized he was no longer thinking about leaving. He was thinking about position. I began preparing quietly. Not defensively. Thoughtfully. I reviewed the timeline in my head. What I had offered. What had been said. What had never been promised. I checked my own messages. Made sure nothing could be misread. Clarity protects both sides, even when only one side values it. I also started talking less. Answering questions briefly. Giving space where space was clearly being used as strategy. He noticed. One evening, he asked if something was wrong. I told him no. That things felt different, but change wasn't always bad. He studied me for a long moment. Like someone trying to read fine print after signing. A week later, He asked about formalizing our arrangement. Suggested a written agreement. Said it would protect both of us. I declined. Not because agreements are bad. Because his interest in protection came only after he felt challenged. That's not balance. That's leverage seeking. His demeanor hardened after that. Not aggressive. Colder. He stopped sharing personal things. Stopped updating me on work. Stopped thanking me for meals. He began speaking about me to others in ways that felt careful, neutral, stripped of context. I heard it secondhand. How he described the living situation as complicated. How he mentioned pressure without details. Pressure is a flexible word. It can be shaped to fit any accusation. I finally addressed it one morning over coffee. Told him I felt a distance between us. Asked him if he still planned to move out once he was stable. He looked surprised. Offended, even. He said he didn't know. That he felt settled. That moving again might be destabilizing. I told him stability was the goal, not the location. That's when his voice changed. He said he had rights too. That he had lived there long enough to be considered more than a guest. That laws existed for a reason. He wasn't threatening. He was informing. I told him calmly that if he felt that way, we should talk to someone impartial. Get clarity. He waved it off. Said he didn't want conflict. Conflict, I learned then, is something people avoid only when they aren't ready to win it. After that conversation, the house no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like contested ground. I stopped offering rides. Stopped cooking extra portions. Not out of spite. Out of definition. Roles had blurred too long. He noticed the change immediately. Asked why I was pulling back. I told him I wasn't pulling back. I was returning to neutral. Neutrality frightened him more than kindness ever had. That's when the performance began in earnest. The sighs. The tired looks. The casual mentions of stress to neighbors. The implication that he was walking on eggshells. I watched it all without interruption. Because by then, I understood something crucial. He wasn't reacting to mistreatment. He was preparing a narrative. And once someone starts writing you into a story you didn't agree to, the only defense is accuracy. I didn't need to expose him. I needed to be consistent. So I stayed calm. Predictable. Clear. I spoke less. Documented more. Not to trap him. To protect myself from distortion. By the time he decided to escalate, the groundwork had already been laid. Not by him. By the truth. And truth, when given time, doesn't need force. It only needs patience. The final stretch before everything broke open was quiet in a way that felt artificial, like a room that has been cleaned too thoroughly. You notice the absence more than the order. He stopped pushing openly. No more questions about rights. No more comments about pressure. Instead, he became agreeable. Too agreeable. He nodded at everything. Smiled easily. Thanked me again for small things he hadn't acknowledged in weeks. That kind of shift doesn't come from peace. Comes from decision. I had seen it before in other contexts. In workplaces. In relationships. When someone stops arguing, it often means they've chosen a different battlefield. I didn't react to the change. I adjusted my expectations. I stopped assuming goodwill and started relying on clarity. That difference matters. One afternoon, he asked if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place we had shared meals for months. He folded his hands neatly and said he wanted to reset things. Said he felt there had been misunderstandings. Said he appreciated everything I had done and didn't want resentment to build. The words were right. The timing was wrong. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I thanked him for saying it and told him I agreed that clarity mattered. I asked him directly what he wanted going forward. He said he wanted stability. Time. Space to rebuild without feeling monitored. I told him I understood. Then I said something I had been holding back. I told him it was time to set a clear end date for his stay. Not immediate. Not punitive. Just defined. The air shifted instantly. He asked why. I told him the truth. That the arrangement had served its purpose. That support isn't meant to become permanent unless both sides agree. That I felt the balance had changed. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned back and crossed his arms. He said I was putting him in a difficult position. I said transitions are difficult by nature. He said he felt blindsided. I said boundaries often feel that way when they arrive later than they should. That was the moment the conversation ended, even though words continued for a few more minutes. He stopped listening. I stopped explaining. He left the table without another word. From that day on, he treated the house like a temporary station. Came and went without acknowledgement. Packed small things quietly. Took calls outside. The politeness returned, but it was hollow. Formal. I didn't press. Deadlines don't need reminders if they're written down. 2 weeks before the agreed date, he told me he would need more time. Said circumstances had changed. Work had slowed. Housing was unstable. I asked how much more time. He didn't answer directly. Said he wasn't sure. Uncertainty, when paired with expectation, becomes manipulation. I told him the date stood. He nodded. Almost relieved. That reaction unsettled me more than resistance would have. In the days that followed, he began acting like a man documenting a final chapter. Taking photos of the room. Of shared spaces. Of himself doing chores. He made sure I saw him doing it. I didn't comment. I also noticed he had started leaving doors open when he spoke on the phone. Not fully open. Just enough. I caught fragments. Words like stress, pressure, feeling unsafe, unbalanced power. He was planting language. I began preparing in earnest then. Not out of fear. Out of respect for process. I organized my records. Printed messages. Sorted dates. I wrote down my own account of events, not as argument, but as memory. Memory fades when it's challenged. Writing steadies it. I also spoke to a lawyer quietly. Not to act. To understand. Knowledge reduces panic. The lawyer listened and asked a single question that stayed with me. Have you been consistent? I said yes. He said that mattered more than intent. The final conversation came 3 days before the move-out date. He stood in the doorway and told me he wasn't leaving. Not angrily. Matter of fact. He said he believed he had established residency. That he had rights. That forcing him out would be illegal. I told him calmly that he was mistaken. That we had agreed to terms. That he was a guest. He smiled slightly. He said we'd see. That night, I slept lightly. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I knew the next step would not be personal. It would be procedural. The notice arrived a week later. But before that, there was one more interaction that stays with me. On his last night in the house, before the papers, he came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He stood quietly for a moment and said, almost gently, that he hadn't wanted things to go this way. I told him neither had I. He asked if there was anything he could do to change my mind. I told him no. Not because I wanted him gone. Because changing my mind now would mean erasing everything I had finally understood. He looked at me then, really looked. And for a brief moment, the performance dropped. I saw fear. Real fear. The kind that doesn't know where to land. Then it was gone. He nodded and walked away. The next morning, he was gone when I woke up. His room was empty except for a few things he had clearly left behind on purpose. Clothes. Papers. Objects meant to suggest haste. Or loss. I didn't touch them. 2 days later, the case began. Part 2 of this story ends there, not with the filing, but with the realization that kindness without clarity invites confusion, and confusion is where manipulation thrives. I didn't become colder after that. I became clearer. And clarity, once learned, doesn't leave you. It waits. For the moment it's needed again. Injustice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes folded inside official language, pretending to be reasonable. The first notice didn't accuse me directly. It suggested concern. It framed itself as protection. It implied imbalance. Words chosen carefully to sound ethical while pointing a finger. I read it slowly. Once. Then again. Not to memorize it. To understand its posture. He claimed emotional distress. Claimed coercion. Claimed an environment that made him feel trapped and indebted. The irony of that last word didn't escape me. I didn't respond immediately. That wasn't denial. That was discipline. I continued my routine. I went to work. I spoke to neighbors as usual. I lived as if nothing had changed, because in my life, nothing had. On paper, everything had. He, on the other hand, moved quickly. He told people his version before questions could be asked. He spoke about vulnerability, about courage, about standing up to quiet oppression. He avoided specifics. Specifics are dangerous when they can be checked. I noticed the change in how people looked at me. Subtle, hesitant, not accusatory, curious. Uncertainty spreads faster than truth because it doesn't wait for proof. That's where humiliation begins. Not in public shaming. In silent recalibration. I let it happen. I understood something then that I hadn't before. The rising conflict wasn't just legal. It was social, emotional, psychological. He wasn't trying to win a case. He was trying to flip the moral frame. If he could become the harmed one, everything else would follow. I didn't defend myself in conversations. I didn't explain. I didn't correct rumors. Explanation often sounds like justification, and justification invites debate. Instead, I stayed consistent. I greeted people the same way. I spoke the same way. I showed up the same way. Consistency is unnerving to someone who is building a shifting story. The next document arrived a week later. Formal language. Requests. Deadlines. It wanted response. I gave it to my lawyer. We went through it line by line. Not emotionally. Strategically. He asked me again if I was angry. I told him no. He said that would matter later. The claims themselves were thin, but they were layered. Emotional distress tied to financial dependency. Dependency tied to implied obligation. Obligation tied to coercion. A story built on implication instead of evidence. That's when I realized the real danger wasn't the court. It was time. Time exhausts people. Makes them reactive, pushes them into mistakes. I refused to rush. The first hearing date was set. Neutral room. Neutral faces. Neutral chairs that never feel neutral when you sit in them. He arrived with confidence sharpened by rehearsal. He spoke first. Controlled. Described the months in ways that felt rehearsed but not memorized. That's always the sign. Memorized stories are rigid. Rehearsed ones can adapt. He painted himself as cautious, as grateful at first, as increasingly uncomfortable. He spoke of subtle pressure, of unspoken expectations, of power imbalance. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. That's how you know someone understands optics. When it was my turn, I didn't counter his emotions. I answered questions. Did I invite him into my home? Yes. Did I provide food and shelter? Yes. Did I ever ask for rent or labor? No. Did I ever threaten eviction? No. Simple answers have weight. The mediator listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. Not many. Just enough. I noticed something then. He interrupted once. Just once. Corrected a detail that hadn't been disputed. It was small, but unnecessary. Unnecessary corrections reveal insecurity. After the session, his lawyer requested additional documentation. Records. Messages. Anything related to the living arrangement. I provided everything. Transparency isn't generous. It's efficient. The days between hearings were where the real conflict lived. Not on record. In anticipation. I caught myself replaying moments late at night. Not to justify myself. To ensure I wasn't missing something. Self-doubt is a tool accusation uses even when it lacks proof. I examined my own behavior carefully. Not defensively. Honestly. Had I ever implied obligation? Had I ever framed help as leverage? Had I ever allowed gratitude to become currency? The answer was no. Not because I was perfect. Because I had been deliberate. That realization steadied me. Meanwhile, his story grew. New details emerged. He added moments of discomfort he had never mentioned before. Claimed tones that hadn't existed. Claimed fear where there had been none. Expansion is another sign. Truth doesn't expand. It clarifies. I noticed something else too. He avoided naming moments where others were present. Avoided dates. Avoided names. Stories that avoid anchors float until they drift into contradiction. The next hearing made that clear. A question was asked about a specific month. He hesitated. Corrected himself. Hesitated again. Not dramatic. Just enough. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I watched the person listening. By the end of that session, the tone had shifted. Not against him. Toward caution. That's all you need. Not victory. Skepticism. Outside the building, he finally looked at me. Really looked. His expression wasn't anger. It was calculation recalibrating. He realized then that this wasn't going to be quick. That realization marked the beginning of his discomfort. The rising conflict doesn't peak with shouting. It rises with pressure applied slowly and evenly. With patience. With accuracy. I didn't celebrate small wins. I didn't mark progress. I waited. Because I knew something he hadn't accounted for. He needed the story to keep moving forward. I didn't. I just needed it to stop drifting long enough for the truth to catch up. And it was already on its way. Pressure doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It settles in quietly, testing where you're weakest. For him, it was time. For me, it was restraint. Between hearings, the silence stretched. Not peaceful silence. Expectant silence. The kind that waits for someone to blink first. He began sending messages through his lawyer more frequently. Requests for extensions. Clarifications. Adjustments to language. Small shifts meant to keep the narrative flexible. I could feel his urgency growing, even without hearing his voice. Urgency is a tell. I stayed slow. I kept working. I kept my routines intact. I woke up early, drank my coffee the same way, walked the same streets. Stability in your body helps stability in your decisions. The neighbors grew more cautious. Some still waved. Some avoided eye contact. A few asked careful questions, phrased as concern. I answered them without detail. Said the situation was being handled properly. That was all. People don't need your side of the story. They need to see whether you behave like someone who believes it. He, on the other hand, began oversharing. I heard it later. How he talked about stress. About standing up to someone with more power. About feeling silenced. Silence, I learned, is easy to misrepresent when you don't weaponize it. The next hearing focused on documentation. Text messages were introduced. Emails. Voicemails. I watched his posture change as the timeline unfolded. Messages of gratitude early on. Neutral updates in the middle. Defensive tones later. The shift was gradual, but undeniable. Context is unforgiving. He tried to explain the gratitude away. Said it was survival language. Said he felt compelled to sound thankful to maintain safety. That argument landed poorly. Safety doesn't usually produce relaxed jokes, shared meals, or casual planning for the future. When one message played, a voicemail thanking me for not letting him disappear, the room went quiet. Not dramatically, just long enough. He looked down. That moment mattered more than any ruling could have. Afterward, his lawyer approached mine again. Quiet conversation. Lowered voices. The words, settlement discussion, floated back to me. I didn't react. The idea of settling wasn't offensive. It was revealing. Settlement means compromise. Compromise means uncertainty. And uncertainty only benefits someone when the truth is uneven. My lawyer asked me privately how I felt. I told him I wasn't interested in buying silence. Not out of pride. Out of principle. Principle is cheaper in the long run. The following weeks tested that resolve. The case dragged. Dates shifted. Delays stacked. Each delay wore on him more than on me. I could see it in his communications. Frustration slipping through professional phrasing. Emotion creeping into what was supposed to be sterile. He wanted resolution. I wanted accuracy. At one point, he attempted a new angle. Claimed I had isolated him socially. That my calm demeanor made confrontation impossible. That my refusal to argue made him feel powerless. That claim surprised me. Not because it was clever. Because it revealed something personal. He needed conflict to validate his position. Without it, his story felt hollow. I didn't change my behavior. I answered questions. I followed procedure. I waited. The mediator began asking sharper questions. Not hostile. Focused. Asking him to clarify motivations. To identify specific moments. To explain why no complaints had been raised during the months he stayed. He struggled there. Because you can't retroactively invent discomfort that never tried to escape. After one particularly tense session, I saw him outside pacing. Phone to his ear. Gesturing sharply. His control was slipping. I stayed inside until he left. Not out of fear. Out of choice. I realized then that the humiliation he sought to impose had reversed direction. Quietly. Invisibly. He had wanted to place me in the role of the accused. Instead, he was trapped defending an expanding story. That's when the power games turned inward. He started contradicting earlier statements. Minor ones. Dates off by days. Descriptions softened or sharpened depending on the question. Nothing explosive. Just enough to erode confidence. Truth wears armor made of repetition. Lies wear disguises that must be adjusted. I felt something unexpected during that phase. Compassion. Not the kind that weakens you. The kind that recognizes desperation. He wasn't evil. He was afraid of being ordinary again. Afraid of losing the narrative that made his struggle meaningful. But compassion doesn't require surrender. I kept my distance. The next request from his side was more direct. A settlement offer. Monetary. Quiet. Framed as closure. I declined. Not because I wanted him to suffer. Because I wanted the story to end correctly. After that, his tone shifted again. Sharper. More confrontational. He accused me of dragging things out intentionally. I didn't respond. Dragging things out implies resistance. I was simply standing still. The final pre-hearing meeting came sooner than expected. It focused on credibility, on consistency, on the viability of the claims moving forward. I could feel the room leaning. Not toward me. Away from him. That distinction matters. The mediator asked him directly why he hadn't left sooner if he felt unsafe. He hesitated. Said he needed time to find housing. Asked why he hadn't documented concerns earlier. He said he hadn't known how. Asked why he continued accepting help if it felt coercive. He didn't answer immediately. Silence stretches differently depending on who owns it. That silence didn't belong to him. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic conclusion. Just a sense of narrowing. Options closing. Space shrinking. Outside, He passed me without acknowledgement. I felt no satisfaction. Just a quiet confirmation. This was no longer about me. The rising conflict had reached its true form, not accusation against character, but exposure of intent. And intent, once visible, loses its power to manipulate. All that remained now was time. And time, unlike stories, cannot be rushed into submission. By the time the final phase of that conflict began, the tension had changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy, like air before rain that never quite falls. The accusations had stopped evolving. They had reached their limit. Now they were just being repeated, as if repetition alone could restore their strength. That's usually how you know a story is dying. The last formal hearing was scheduled without ceremony. No urgency. No drama. Just another date on paper. Another room. Another table. I arrived early again. Sat in the same chair I had chosen before. Familiarity matters when everything else is uncertain. He arrived later than usual. Not late enough to draw attention. Late enough to signal fatigue. His posture was different. Less rehearsed. Less certain. He had worn confidence like armor for months, and it was starting to chafe. When the session began, the tone was restrained. Almost clinical. The mediator asked fewer questions this time. Not because they didn't matter. Because the answers were already on record. This stage wasn't about discovery. It was about confirmation. He spoke first again. His voice was softer now. Less polished. He repeated earlier claims, but without embellishment. The emotion had thinned. What remained sounded obligatory. I listened without expression. When it was my turn, I was asked one question that mattered more than all the others combined. Why did you help him? The room went still. Not because the answer was dramatic. Because intention changes everything. I didn't answer quickly. Not to create effect. To be precise. I said I helped him because I could. Because I had space. Because I remembered what it felt like to need help and not know who to ask. I said I never expected repayment. Not gratitude. Not loyalty. Just independence. I said that at the moment I felt the arrangement was no longer healthy, I set a boundary. Calmly. Clearly. And I accepted whatever reaction followed. I didn't describe him. I described myself. That distinction matters. The mediator nodded slowly. Not in agreement. In understanding. He was asked the same question. His answer wandered. He spoke about circumstances. About systems. About fear. About imbalance. He spoke around the question instead of through it. That's when the conversation ended, even though words continued. There was a pause afterward. The kind that signals conclusion without announcing it. We were told a decision would follow. Outside, the hallway felt narrower than before. Not physically. Emotionally. Like the story had reached the point where no one wanted to stand inside it anymore. I didn't look for him. I didn't need to. The decision came 2 weeks later. The claims were dismissed. Not partially. Not conditionally. Fully. The language was measured. Professional. But the meaning was clear. There was no evidence of coercion. No proof of obligation. No pattern of abuse. The arrangement was deemed voluntary. The boundary lawful. I read it once. Then folded it and put it away. That was it. No relief washed over me. No triumph. Just stillness. Later that evening, I sat in the same kitchen where it had all begun. Same chair. Same light. Same quiet. I thought about the months leading up to that moment. The shifts. The signs. The choices I had made not to escalate, not to explain, not to perform innocence. I realized something important then. The humiliation he tried to inflict never landed because I refused to wear it. Humiliation requires participation. It needs reaction. It feeds on defense. I gave it none. In the days that followed, I noticed the neighborhood adjusting back. Conversations returned to normal. Eye contact resumed. Curiosity dissolved into routine. Stories without endings don't survive long. I heard later that he had moved again. That he told a different version of the story somewhere else. That he framed the dismissal as technical, not moral. That didn't matter. People who live by narratives will always need new audiences. I didn't need to correct him. Correction keeps you connected. What mattered was what stayed with me. I learned that helping someone doesn't obligate them to goodness, but it does obligate you to clarity. That silence can be misread, but it cannot be misquoted. That calm is not weakness, it's containment. Most of all, I learned that quiet revenge isn't about watching someone fall. It's about standing still while they reveal themselves. There was no moment where I felt like justice had been served in a dramatic sense. No closing speech. No final look exchanged. Justice arrived the way it usually does when it's real. Quietly. Without witnesses. Without asking how I felt about it. That was enough. Part 3 of this story isn't about victory. It's about endurance. About allowing pressure to pass through you without changing your shape. Because when you don't let injustice harden you, it loses its final advantage. And that's when you realize something that stays with you long after the papers are filed and the rooms are emptied. Sometimes the strongest response to humiliation is dignity. And dignity, once practiced, becomes untouchable. Danger doesn't always look like a threat. Sometimes it looks like relief arriving too early. After the dismissal, people assumed the story was over. In their minds, conflict follows a straight line. Problem, struggle, resolution, end. But resolution is only an event. Turning points are internal. The real shift happened after the noise stopped, when there was no one left to perform for. I returned to my routines with intention. Same mornings, same work, same quiet evenings. But something inside me had sharpened. Not hardened. Sharpened. I started noticing patterns I had once ignored, not just in him, but in myself. How easily patience can slide into tolerance. How clarity delayed becomes conflict multiplied. How silence, when unstructured, invites interpretation. That awareness didn't feel like regret. It felt like inheritance. A lesson paid for, now owned. The turning point wasn't about making him lose more. It was about ensuring he couldn't repeat the same move with me, or anyone else, in the same way. Quiet revenge doesn't chase. It closes doors gently but permanently. A month after the dismissal, I received a call from someone I didn't recognize. Calm voice. Professional. They said they were verifying a reference. They mentioned his name. I didn't react. I asked what kind of reference they were seeking. They said housing. Temporary arrangement. They said he had listed me as someone who could speak to his character and prior living situation. I paused. Not because I was surprised. Because I understood exactly what this was. He was rewriting again. Using proximity to credibility. Hoping silence would fill the gaps in his favor. I didn't refuse to speak. I didn't embellish. I told the truth. I said he had stayed with me temporarily during a difficult period. That the arrangement had ended. That legal action had followed. That it had been dismissed. I didn't offer opinion. I didn't offer advice. I let facts do what facts do when left alone. The call ended politely. 2 weeks later, I heard through someone else that the housing opportunity had fallen through. No explanation given. Just a change of direction. I felt nothing about that. No satisfaction. No guilt. Consequence doesn't require emotion. Then came the email. Short. Careful. He asked if we could talk. Said he wanted to clear the air. Said he was trying to move forward and hoped I wasn't standing in the way. That line stayed with me. Standing in the way. As if my existence was an obstacle to his narrative. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish him. Because responding would place me back inside a story I had already exited. That was the turning point. not his loss. My exit. I began making small changes that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with structure. I formalized boundaries in my life that had once been implied. I wrote things down. I clarified expectations. I stopped assuming shared understanding. I also started volunteering again, but differently. Through organizations. With process. With oversight. I didn't stop helping people. I stopped doing it alone. That's a form of quiet revenge too, denying someone the opportunity to misuse your kindness again. Months passed. Then another call came. This time from an employer. Same pattern. Verification. Reference. Same name. I gave the same response. Factual. No commentary. The employer thanked me and ended the call. A week later, the email arrived again. Longer this time. Less controlled. He accused me of sabotaging him. Of holding a grudge. Of punishing him beyond what was fair. I read it once. Then I archived it. Punishment requires intent. I had none. What I had was memory and accuracy. That's when I understood what quiet revenge really looks like. It's not action. It's alignment. When you align your behavior with truth so consistently that lies have nowhere to land, you don't have to push back. Reality does the work for you. I never spoke his name publicly. Never corrected his version to others. Never warned people. I simply stayed consistent when asked. Consistency is devastating to manipulation. Over time, the requests stopped. Not because he changed. Because I was no longer useful to the story he needed. That's when the weight finally lifted. Not because justice had been served, but because influence had been removed. The turning point wasn't the courtroom. It was the moment I realized that the most intelligent revenge is refusing to be a resource for someone's dishonesty. I didn't take anything from him. I took myself out of reach. And that kind of revenge doesn't look like victory. It looks like peace returning slowly, then all at once. That's when I knew the story had truly turned. The weeks that followed the turning point were quiet, but not empty. Silence carries a different weight when it's chosen rather than imposed. I moved through my days with the same routines, yet I was acutely aware of what had shifted, inside me, and in the space he had once occupied. He no longer visited. No messages, no calls, no attempts to reinsert himself into my life. That absence was revealing. People often think revenge requires confrontation. It doesn't. Sometimes the absence of your reaction is the sharpest edge. I spent that time reflecting, not obsessing. I reviewed what had happened carefully, not to dwell on it, but to understand it. The initial help I gave had been genuine, uncomplicated by expectation. The escalation that followed had been entirely on his side. My responsibility had been clear. Boundaries, clarity, and consistency. Nothing more. That reflection led me to another insight. Trust and expectation are separate things. When we give, people may or may not respond in kind. You cannot control that. But you can control how you act when their response betrays your expectation. That difference is crucial, and most people never notice it until it's too late. He began appearing indirectly in my life again. Through rumors, through casual mentions by neighbors, through small, almost imperceptible attempts to rewrite the past. Each time, I paid attention, not out of spite, but to verify accuracy. Verification doesn't require confrontation. It requires observation. One afternoon, a neighbor approached me casually. "Did you hear," she asked, "that he's saying you left him in the street?" I didn't flinch. Not because it wasn't upsetting, but because it wasn't true. Words have power only when you allow them to define reality. I told her simply, "That's not accurate. He stayed with me for months, and he left when it was agreed. Everything else is conjecture." Her expression softened, not from my insistence, but from the clarity in my tone. People sense when truth is stable. Lies wobble even before they're spoken aloud. Meanwhile, he continued with his life, presumably believing he could bend narratives in his favor elsewhere. But reality follows those who align with it. Misrepresentation eventually meets fact, even if delayed. Months later, I received a formal inquiry from a prospective landlord who had been listed as a reference. They wanted to know if he had been a reliable tenant. I recounted, calmly and truthfully, the months he spent in my home. I spoke plainly about what he had done, what he hadn't done, and the circumstances of his departure. No embellishment. No anger. Just the record. Within days, I heard indirectly that he hadn't secured the lease. The landlord had reservations, not because of spite, but because truth tends to create friction for false narratives. I realized then that quiet, consistent integrity can be more potent than any argument or confrontation. People can mislead, manipulate, or threaten all they want. But when someone remains immovable in fact, lies fail to gain traction. I began applying the same principle elsewhere in my life. I strengthened boundaries with colleagues who relied too heavily on borrowed trust. I clarified expectations in friendships that had grown ambiguous. I extended help again, but this time with structure and accountability built in. It wasn't cynicism. It was wisdom earned from the months of trial. During this time, I occasionally reflected on him, not with resentment, but with recognition of human frailty. People who have never known stability react differently when it is suddenly offered. They can embrace it, misuse it, or feel entitled by it. I had experienced all three outcomes, and the lesson was clear. Generosity without clarity invites complexity. Then came the unexpected. He reached out directly. A short message, polite but carefully crafted. He claimed he had learned lessons, that he wanted to apologize, that he wished there had been understanding instead of conflict. I read the message carefully. I didn't respond immediately. I allowed the message to settle as a document of intent, not as a conversation. Days later, I chose to respond, briefly. I acknowledged his message, accepted the apology in principle, and wished him well. No discussion. No engagement. Just closure. That simple act changed everything. Not for him. For me. Closure isn't about vindication. It's about reclaiming peace. When you offer it without expectation, it's unassailable. Over the following months, life returned to normal. The neighborhood continued its quiet rhythm. Work continued its familiar pace. Evenings were as calm as they had always been. And yet, there was an underlying confidence that hadn't existed before, a certainty born from having endured the rise and manipulation without compromising one's values. I realized then that the turning point wasn't a courtroom or a conversation. It wasn't a rejection or a legal dismissal. It was the moment I decided to act only according to principle and truth, regardless of what others believed or claimed. That moment, quiet and internal, shifted the entire arc of the situation. This is the essence of quiet, intelligent revenge. Not spectacle. Not retaliation. Not dramatics. Simply remaining aligned with what is right, letting reality follow its course while others struggle to impose narratives on it. And in that alignment, justice arrives naturally, not as punishment, but as consequence. Not through aggression, but through consistency. Not through shouting, but through endurance. From that turning point forward, I carry the lesson carefully. People may try to manipulate the past, leverage your generosity, or distort your actions. But if you respond with clarity, consistency, and patience, truth becomes a shield, and time becomes an ally. It isn't dramatic. It isn't fast. It isn't satisfying in a conventional sense. But it is permanent. And permanence is a quiet kind of power few recognize until it is already complete. I moved through my days with a renewed understanding of generosity, boundaries, and observation. Every interaction, whether with friends, neighbors, or strangers, carried a subtle awareness. Help is valuable, but clarity is priceless. And as he faded from my life, not in defeat but in irrelevance, I realized the final lesson. Revenge doesn't need to humiliate. It doesn't need to force acknowledgement. Sometimes, it is simply letting someone reveal themselves in full, while you remain aligned, consistent, and free. That understanding settled in me as the months passed, quietly, like a tide that reshapes the coastline without announcement. And I carried it forward, stronger, wiser, and calm. Quiet revenge is never about victory over others. It is about victory over the chaos they try to impose on your life, and that victory is both complete and enduring. By the time I fully understood the turning point, I realized it wasn't an event. It wasn't a single moment. It was a process, slow, deliberate, almost imperceptible. And it didn't involve him anymore. It involved me. The real shift came when I stopped thinking about what he could do to me and started thinking about what I would allow into my life going forward. That distinction seems simple, but it's profound. Most people react. I learned to act with foresight. That's the difference between revenge and quiet, intelligent resolution. I began cataloging boundaries I had taken for granted. Boundaries with neighbors, colleagues, friends, even family. I realized that generosity without clarity had almost cost me my peace, and that clarity was now my priority. I wrote things down. I formalized agreements. I stopped assuming trust would fill gaps. The subtle power of this approach became obvious when people who had observed the situation indirectly began noticing the difference. They didn't confront me about him. They didn't need to. They simply approached interactions with a more measured respect. Consistency communicates more than explanation ever could. He, meanwhile, continued on his path, somewhere distant from me. I heard bits and pieces, through neighbors, mutual acquaintances, but never directly. He was reconstructing his story elsewhere, no doubt embellishing and omitting details to suit his audience. That mattered less and less over time. Influence only lasts where it has foundation. He had none with me. One day, I received a brief message from him. Short, carefully phrased, apologetic, trying to acknowledge past mistakes. I read it and sat with it for a moment. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to ensure that any engagement would be measured, not reactive. The temptation to lecture, to justify, or to assert dominance was there, but I resisted. That was the final test. When I eventually replied, it was deliberate. Simple acknowledgement. Acceptance of his apology. A wish for his well-being. No commentary. No discussion. No invitation for dialogue. Closure doesn't require performance. It simply requires detachment from outcomes that are no longer your responsibility. That small exchange reinforced the lesson that had been building for months. Revenge is not about demonstrating superiority. It is about preserving your own integrity and letting truth operate independently. I noticed subtle changes in myself during this period. A deeper patience. A more intuitive understanding of character. A refusal to overextend trust without clarity. I realized that the months of tension had forged a sharper awareness. Not cynicism, but discernment. Generosity could still exist without vulnerability being exploited. Kindness could coexist with vigilance. I began applying these lessons in everyday life. When offering help, I clearly defined limits. When trusting others, I observed boundaries. When disagreements arose, I assessed them calmly, always seeking alignment with facts rather than emotion. This wasn't about becoming detached or cold, it was about resilience. Even in casual interactions, I noticed a difference in how people responded. There was respect. There was recognition. Not because I demanded it, but because I acted predictably and with integrity. Consistency builds credibility. Credibility becomes armor against manipulation. Months turned into a year. The memory of his presence faded, not because it was erased, but because it was neutralized. There was no lingering fear, no residual anger, no desire for revenge beyond what had already occurred. The lesson had been absorbed fully. During that time, I reflected often on the nature of betrayal, the subtle forms it takes, the ways goodwill can be misused, the temptation to respond emotionally. And most importantly, the distinction between justice sought externally and justice realized internally. The latter is permanent. The former is fleeting. I also considered the community around me. How easily people accept narratives if they are repeated confidently. How important it is to maintain alignment with truth, not for their sake, but for yours. Reputation is not what others say about you. It's how you behave when your integrity is challenged. One afternoon, as I walked through my neighborhood, I realized the final shift had occurred. I no longer registered his potential presence in my thoughts unless I deliberately recalled it. My concern had shifted entirely inward, to maintaining my own clarity, my own calm, and my own boundaries. That moment of internal realignment was the true turning point. Not the court's decision. Not the legal dismissal. Not the brief apology. It was my choice to stop being a participant in his narrative and to reclaim the narrative of my own life. I carried this lesson forward in every aspect of my life. Work became more intentional. Friendships more selective. Generosity more structured. Peace more deliberate. The subtle, patient approach I had cultivated through months of observation and restraint became a defining principle. And in that calm, I finally understood the essence of quiet revenge. Not retaliation. Not spectacle. Not domination. Simply living aligned with truth, allowing others to reveal themselves while remaining unwavering in your own integrity. By the time the anniversary of the final decision arrived, I could look back without bitterness. The months of deception, tension, and manipulation had taught a deeper lesson than any courtroom ruling ever could. They had reinforced the strength of patience, the power of consistency, and the enduring effect of integrity. That is the true turning point of this story. Not when someone else falters, but when you realize you are unshakable. Quiet revenge is invisible to those it concerns, but transformative for the one who practices it. It does not seek applause. It does not seek acknowledgement. It does not demand participation. It simply exists, steady, measured, and ultimately unconquerable. And in that realization, I found the calm I had been seeking all along, a calm built not on circumstance, but on certainty, patience, and moral alignment. The world continued, neighbors continued, life continued. But I moved through it differently now. Not reactive. Not resentful. Not bound by the attempts of others to manipulate perception. Simply aligned with truth, carrying the quiet, enduring power that comes from living with clarity, dignity, and unwavering self-possession. This is the moment when quiet revenge completes itself, not with drama, confrontation, or spectacle, but with a complete, internal reclaiming of one's peace and integrity. The months that followed the turning point were strangely liberating. I had expected some residue of anger, some urge to monitor, some lingering tension, but what arrived was different. Silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of consequence realized. He was gone. The case was closed. And yet, life felt fuller than it had in years. I moved through my mornings deliberately. Coffee brewed the same way. Routes to work unchanged. Yet every step carried a new awareness. Not fear. Not triumph. Just understanding. Understanding that boundaries, once respected, create freedom, and boundaries, once ignored, demand vigilance. Neighbors noticed subtle changes. Small gestures. Courteous conversation without unnecessary explanation. I could feel the difference in their tone. People who had once been curious or cautious now treated me with natural ease. They didn't need to know the details. They just sensed a consistency that commanded respect. I began to notice other shifts too. Invitations from colleagues were no longer hesitant. Friends spoke more freely, without the weight of uncertainty. Even casual interactions carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Clarity matters. People respond to it, whether they understand why or not. During this period, I reflected often on the nature of generosity. How easily goodwill can be exploited, and how subtle the exploitation can be. I remembered the early days of helping him, how natural it had felt to provide support without expectation, and I recognized the lessons embedded in that experience. Generosity is valuable, but clarity ensures it is not weaponized. Work became a different kind of arena. Tasks were approached with meticulous care. I documented more thoroughly, clarified responsibilities, and set expectations explicitly. Not because I had lost trust in people, but because experience had taught me the cost of unspoken assumptions. Clarity was armor. Efficiency followed. At home, life regained its rhythm. Meals were shared without performance, conversations flowed without subtext, and the atmosphere felt unburdened. The home that had once been a stage for subtle power struggles became a space of calm, structured by routine, clarity, and unshakable boundaries. Occasionally, I heard from mutual acquaintances about him. He had moved again. New arrangements. New stories. Attempts to establish credibility elsewhere. But each account carried its own cracks, omissions, exaggerations, contradictions. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His story was irrelevant. Reality had already moved on. One afternoon, a colleague asked me how I had maintained composure throughout the ordeal. How I had avoided escalation while being falsely accused. I explained carefully, without embellishment. Patience, observation, consistency, and adherence to truth. That, I told them, is where quiet strength lies. Not in confrontation, but in alignment with fact and principle. I began to apply that lesson in broader ways. When helping others, I established expectations clearly. When engaging with friends or colleagues, I defined boundaries without apology. When faced with potential conflict, I observed before reacting. The difference wasn't in how people treated me, it was in how I preserved my own integrity regardless of their choices. Months became a year. Each day reinforced the lesson. Peace doesn't come from controlling others, it comes from controlling your own actions. Revenge doesn't come from punishing, it comes from refusing to participate in manipulation. Integrity doesn't require approval, it only requires consistency. During this period, I also revisited the idea of forgiveness. Not for him, not yet. For myself. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as absolution for others. I realized it is first and foremost a gift you give yourself. By forgiving, you release the hold past actions have on your present, allowing calm to fill spaces once occupied by uncertainty and tension. I thought about the months of rising conflict, the courtroom hearings, the subtle manipulations, and the indirect attempts to influence perception. And I realized something: revenge, when practiced through patience and integrity, is not about watching someone falter. It's about standing unwavering while they reveal themselves in full. In the months following, life returned to a new normal, but with a sharper awareness. I noticed patterns in human behavior that I had previously overlooked. How quickly someone can reconstruct a narrative. How they rely on silence, implication, or assumption to gain advantage. How clarity and consistency neutralize those attempts. This awareness was not paranoid. It was practical. It didn't prevent generosity, but it did prevent exploitation. It didn't breed distrust, but it encouraged precision. Every interaction carried a subtle but deliberate clarity. People responded differently. They respected boundaries, observed them, and treated commitments seriously. One evening, I reflected on what had been accomplished. Not in a legal sense, not in terms of defeating him, but in the reclamation of my own life. In the preservation of calm. In the restoration of my home, my routines, my principles. That realization carried its own satisfaction. Quiet, unspoken, and absolute. It was then I understood the true resolution of conflict. It is not in headlines, legal filings, or social recognition. It is in the internal alignment of your actions with truth, in the calm that emerges when manipulation fails to take root, and in the unshakable confidence that comes from standing by your principles. I began to extend that lesson outward. Volunteering. Mentoring. Offering support in ways that were structured, clear, and sustainable. Generosity returned, not blind, not unguarded, but intentional. The peace I had reclaimed allowed me to act from wisdom rather than reaction. Even when encountering challenges unrelated to him, I approached them differently. Small conflicts at work, disagreements with neighbors, misunderstandings with friends, all were met with measured clarity. Patience was no longer passive, it was deliberate. Observation was no longer tentative, it was strategic. Integrity was no longer fragile, it was foundational. And in all of this, I carried the understanding that the most profound revenge is often invisible. It does not shout, it does not display, it does not demand recognition. It simply exists, steady and unyielding. It is reflected in every calm decision, every boundary maintained, every act of generosity administered with clarity. Over time, his presence became a memory, but the lessons endured. I had learned to observe without being drawn in, to act without overreacting, and to allow truth to operate without my interference. The ordeal, though painful at the time, had forged a new sense of resilience, self-possession, and moral clarity.